This week at the Roundtable, a study that set out to track thousands of bass that are caught every summer by pro and amateur fishermen competing in national and regional fishing tournaments on Lake Champlain. Researchers tagged hundreds of fish and outfitted dozens with tiny radio transmitters so they could track where they go in the lake. The whole idea was to get a better idea the impact that these fishing tournaments are having on the lake's prized bass. And we are joined by the researchers who headed up the study, Tim Mihuc with the Lake Champlain Research Institute at SUNY Plattsburgh, and Mark Malchoff with Lake Champlain Sea Grant. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here. Lake Champlain is certainly known for its bass fishing. It's been hosting these tournaments, about a half dozen tournaments every summer for several years now. They draw professional fishermen from around the country, have worldwide audiences on television, so they're important to the region, to the economy, and they provide a great recreation for folks. So at the same time, over the past few years, there were some concerns, though, that as Plattsburgh was hosting these tournaments on Lake Champlain, that it could be having a negative impact on some of the fish. Did we see die-offs of fish, and is that what raised a few red flags, and folks decided maybe we ought to take a look at the effect this is having on the bass?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. As you say, there's community concern, so that kind of gave us the opportunity to write some proposals to seek some funding. And the concern is multifaceted. Is there an impact on the population? What do we know about dispersal? What do we know about stress and mortality? And we were able to kind of tackle some of those questions. Our focus was not to get a direct handle on mortality, but rather what are some of the sublethal effects? Do you move some fish around? Do they go home? How long does it take them to go home? Is there a difference between species and the rate at which they go home, if they go home, and those sorts of things? And we also had an opportunity to try to look at and collect information on some of the signs of stress that these fish exhibit. And we did that with an idea in mind that you could maybe develop some better management practices out of that information. So that's kind of how we get into this.
And that's what came out of it. After 2 years, you came up with a number of recommendations to say, here are ways we think that you can reduce stress and take better care of the fish populations.
And actually what come out of it is our grad student who worked on this, his name was George Maynard, has already published a paper on that. So we have a paper out in the literature on fish stress in Lake Champlain at bass tournaments. With respect to mortality at the tournaments we visited during this study, we recorded less than 5% mortality at all of those tournaments. So if you're willing to accept a 5% mortality rate at a bass tournament, which most people are, keep in mind if there's 2,000 fish at a tournament, 5% can be quite a few fish. But overall, it's not that big of an impact on the population.
Does that seem to be the norm for tournaments across the country, 5% acceptable?
Yeah, and you'll see numbers higher than that, especially in the south with higher water temperatures. Sometimes you'll see numbers lower than that. And the industry's been kind of collecting this sort of information for 20, 30 years now, and you're going to have some mortality. There's no question about that. And I think people need to recognize that some level, perhaps even as much as 20%, is acceptable. And at the same time, I think the industry perhaps should be a little careful not to overpromise that, when they promise that 0% or 2%.
That's just not possible.
It may not be realistic overall.
When the national fishing tournaments come to town, they do make it known that they take steps and precautions to try to keep as many fish alive as possible, from being reeled into the boat to brought in and weighed, and then put on a boat and taken back out into the lake and released.
Yeah, and our direct experience with a variety of different types of tournaments is that those national tournaments, and I would say FLW in particular, are very good at what they do, and they take every step they can to protect the fish and keep the fish. Those big tournaments are actually among the best at treating the fish.
Were there some suggestions, though, that you had for them that you thought maybe would even improve the chances of the fish surviving?
Yeah, so one of the things that came out of this is we've got a 4-page summary sheet that's available to folks, and we're starting to get that out now. But you can take a look at some of the release sites. After the fish are weighed, they're taken to a release boat, and they usually just try to get these fish out into deeper water, get them away from shore, and then get back to shore so they can take more fish out. So some of our dispersal results suggest that if possible, these fish would be a little better served if those release sites could be moved a little bit farther offshore, kind of jumpstart this dispersal process, and at the same time reduce the chance that these fish are going to be recaptured by shore-based anglers, because there's something that people might not immediately think of. You drop a lot of big fish into a relatively small area, they're relatively healthy and they're sort of hungry and they're subject to recapture. So how does that all play out? So that's the primary recommendation, and we need to talk to the FLW people in particular, and I'm going to do that soon, see if this is practical advice. But instead of just, for example, moving a quarter mile off Wilcox Dock, is it feasible to take the release boat to Crab Island? Is it feasible to take the release boat to Cumberland Head proper for that release?
Put them farther out in the lake.
And that was the problems from dumping so many fish right into Cumberland Bay?
Well, we radio tracked over 80 fish, and we followed those fish, some cases for almost 2 years. And we had tags in over 2,000 fish where anglers would report back if they caught that fish. All of those results suggest that it's at least 2 or 3 months before a fish would leave Cumberland Bay, typically, and it would definitely be 3-4 weeks before even any fish would leave. So this idea of stocking the fish in Cumberland Bay is pretty much in play. And if you think about a major tournament could release 2,000 fish in 2 days, if not more. That's a lot of really big size catchable 12-inch plus bass to put in one place.
One concentrate area.
And it creates essentially what you would call a put and take fishery.
Now the major tournaments, are they open to these ideas, do you think? Or is there the fear that if you make these suggestions that they could say, well, we'll go find another lake to hold our tournament on?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think we've had dialogue with these folks. Ron Lapham with FLW's very receptive, very interested in research, and that industry has supported other researchers in the past. So I think there's a dialogue that we can initiate there, and we'll see where it goes. But I think there's some changes that we can.
And during all of our research, they've been very supportive, and they want to see our results. So I think they'll be open.
Because they like the idea of promoting a healthier fish population.
Exactly.
They want to look like good stewards and be good stewards.
And they are good stewards. I would point that out. The reality is, if that many people went and fished on the lake and caught their 5-bag limit, those people could take all those fish home.
Yeah.
The tournament people choose to release the fish back to the lake. They could take those fish home. They could take their 5 fish every day. So those 2,000 fish might not even be in the lake if the tournaments had a different policy there. No, they want to be good stewards of the lake, and they are.
Now, you mentioned the transmitters and the tagging. You mentioned how the fish tend to stay in Cumberland Bay for a few weeks, 3 months after the tournament. I think a lot of people probably wonder and would be interested to see what you found out. From that point, do they then head back to the area where they were caught? Do they have that instinct to know how to go? And is that possible? I mean, some of these fish, or many of these fish, are coming from the south end of the lake, and then the fishermen motor for 2 hours to get up to the weigh station in Plattsburgh. That's 100 miles away.
That's a really good question, Tom. We ended up, our fish were moving so far after those 3 months that we ended up tracking them by airplanes. Because that's how we had to find them. And some of the fish moved very long distances, 25 miles from Plattsburgh. No fish actually went back all the way back home to where they were caught, and none of the fish went back south to Ticonderoga. None of those largemouth bass that are caught there. Those become North Lake residents once they're released. But they did go as far north as Rouse's Point and all the way up back into the northeast arm from Plattsburgh. So we do get dispersal. It's delayed, like I said. It might take a year for a fish to go that 20 miles or 25 miles, but they ultimately do disperse. And Mark, I think, can tell you about a tag we just had recovered, which is after 3 years of tagging. So
yeah, that was sort of interesting. A lot of our tagging data were just T-bar tags, excuse me, that are implanted in the fish.
Yeah.
They're quick, they're cheap. It's got my email address, phone number on there. That you can get a lot more information from the radio tags, but you can do a lot more of the T-bar tags more quickly, more cheaply. So we had, I don't know, almost 2,000 fish with the T-bar tags in them. In the literature, the scientific literature indicates that most of these tags are going to get rejected after 200 or 300 days, but some of them will persist. And our study ended in 2012. We're still getting T-bar tag data. Just the other day I got an email from a gentleman that had caught a largemouth bass in Cary Bay that had been released in Cumberland Bay. So
3 years ago.
3 years, and that fish did go home. You know, the tiny percentage, and it took a long time, but that guy went home.
Yeah. And do you think, is that is the guess that if they could go long distances, they would try to get back either to their home or spawning grounds?
They're not salmon. You know, they don't have the visual chemical cues that salmon do. So I think it's unrealistic to expect that any significant number of these fish are going to go back to the spot where they caught. They're
going to go where good habitat
exactly.
is.
They're looking for a good good place to eat. And
there's lots of good homes out there. They're just going to go there.
If you're pulling so many out of the South Lake, though, and it's so many fishermen do go down there to catch them, does that raise concerns, or is this such a small percentage of the bass in Lake Champlain that it really doesn't have that much of an impact?
I think it's such a small percentage that it doesn't have an impact. We have, assessed the population dynamics in the lake as part of this study, and Lake Champlain has an extremely healthy bass fishery. And there's absolutely no evidence over the last 10 to 12 years with these tournaments lake-wide that there's been any decline in the fishery. And our study really provides even better evidence that the fishery is intact and the health of the fishery is in pretty good shape. So removing the number of fish that are removed for tournaments that come to Plattsburgh from the South Lake doesn't seem really to be having a population impact lake-wide at all.
We did a couple of things. We looked at looked for changes in bag weights at the tournaments over time. Excuse me. Saw no evidence of change at all. We also looked at condition factor of fish. It's just a measure of plumpness. What's the relationship between length to weight? Going towards obesity is good, and we got to measure that, and we're able to compare the plumpness of these fish to Hudson River, to St. Lawrence River, to some other water bodies, and they stack up pretty good to that. Yeah. The other thing I'd point out is, we talk about fish that may be captured in Ticonderoga or South Bay or whatever and brought to Plattsburgh, or Missisquoi Bay and brought to Plattsburgh. The vast majority of these fish are, well, not the vast, a large chunk of these fish are being caught in the inland sea. And they're smallmouth. And as I understand the tournament strategies, especially early in the season, smallmouth will keep you in the tournament, but the largemouth you need the largemouth to win the tournament. So days 1, 2, or 1, 2, and 3, I think the focus is more on large numbers of smallmouth from relatively close distances, and then the folks that are, in the top 5, top 10, they may change their focus to larger fish for more distant areas. But their preference is to fish closer, because they know that there's some stress involved with transporting these fish in live wells. They don't want to stress the fish any more than necessary. They'll lose points if they bring in a dead fish. The emphasis is on live fish. So they don't want to transport these fish these long distances. But when it gets down to the last day and you need the big pounds to place or win,
that's when you go to the secret spot. But the other days of the tournament, they're not all automatically going there and just pulling out fish from the same exact spot.
A lot of that depends on the weather. Lake Champlain, for these bass boats, is not necessarily the best conditions. These bass boats aren't really designed for our lake. And if we get any more than 2-foot chop, it's difficult for them to go to Ticonderoga. So weather kind of dictates their strategy.
And when they do, you can hear them as they're slapping on the water as they are flying down there on the day of the tournaments.
And we did this assessment of the stress of the fish as they came through the tournament. How stressed are they? And that's the paper that George has published. And we had a strong relationship with the stress on an individual fish versus the distance it traveled to get to Plattsburgh. In other words, where was it caught, and how long did it have a boat ride? And they were much more stressed the farther away they came from. And that's an interesting result. It does tell us that, when you do these tournaments, the farther you travel fish in a boat, the more stressful it is on them.
Did anything come out of the study that you think would benefit researchers or biologists? Not necessarily the fishing tournaments, but did you help answer any nagging questions about these fish and their lives in the lake?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that George authored in the paper that was kind of interesting to me and news to me is, as I mentioned, we collected a whole suite of stress signs. We looked at the occurrence of bloody fin rays, ocular emphysema, cloudiness in the eyes that would be associated with barotrauma, pulling fish up from depth. We looked at the absence of dorsal fin erection. When you, if a fish is struggling when you're holding it, it will erect its dorsal fin with spines. Mm-hmm. If it's vigorous, if it's not, it won't do that.
It's like a dog that lays its tail down or has its tail up.
Yeah, so we recorded all this stuff in a few others too. In analyzing the data, George figured out that hemorrhaging in these fish, the bloody fin rays, is probably more associated with stress, time or distance in the live well, than it is with barotrauma. And previously, other researchers had been tagging that, or laying the blame on bloody fin rays as a function of barotrauma, pulling up fish from depth. And by kind of subtracting and adding our results together with some previous work and looking at differences in methods, we figured out that probably this bloody fin rays is just a general handling stress or live well stress, not so much bringing fish up from depth. Yeah. And that kind of brings up something too. There's one of the techniques that anglers and tournament organizers will do to try to release fish healthy is they will fizz them. They will actually let gas out of the swim bladders to make it easier for fish to submerge that may have been brought up quickly from depth that would otherwise have problems submerging. Lots of times fish will exhibit a loss of equilibrium, and it can be confused with barotrauma, and it's really not. It's just a loss of equilibrium. We actually found very little occurrence of real barotrauma in these animals. And when it gets pretty warm, some smallmouth will be deeper in the water column because it's cooler, and anglers pull those fish up, they will exhibit barotrauma. But the vast majority of the fish that we saw, we didn't see any barotrauma. We could see things that could be confused with barotrauma, but as it turns out, they were not barotrauma.
Yeah, a lot of people would probably think that oxygen depletion would be one of the biggest obstacles, but steps are taken along the way to make sure that they're in the water as much as possible, and even to add additional oxygen to the water?
Yeah, and so there's various things that you can use. You can try to add chemicals to the water, which is questionable whether those chemicals do anything for oxygen levels. You obviously need to oxygenate your live well, and then there's the tanks on shore at the tournament event. And we assessed oxygen in all of those situations. And there may be some issues with some tournaments with the oxygen in their shore tanks. We've had a number of discussions with tournament organizers to help improve that. But maybe one thing we discovered is it might not so much be oxygen. As if we're saturating oxygen, the fish are getting as much as they can out of that particular water temperature. Oftentimes what a tournament will do, though, and this is a sort of a practice thing that we discovered, it wasn't really part of what our research study was designed to address. Sometimes they ice the tanks at the tournament landing to cool them, and cooler water holds more oxygen. It's basically the laws of physics. But icing it can cool it so much where you might shock the fish. Pull them out of the lake that's a warmer temperature, cool it more than 5 degrees, and you're going to shock that fish, which will then add a whole series of stresses to it that are not necessarily related to oxygen.
So it's a fine line trying to manage
the temperature fluctuation.
We actually discovered in our measurements at tournaments that there's probably more serious issues with them maintaining the lake temperature, not too warm and not too cold. And too cold became almost more of an issue because of the icing. And so we actually would suggest that tournaments maintain ambient lake temperature as close as they can. And all of our systems that we use for the research, we're flowing natural surface lake water through our tanks. And we think it wouldn't be that difficult for tournaments. They fill their tanks with massive pumps. They could maintain a surface flow through those tanks, and their temperature issues and oxygen issues would largely go away.
Are lampreys a problem for the bass or primarily for trout and salmon? Do they not tend to wound the bass?
We did see wounds.
Yeah, we recorded the occurrence of lamprey wound in this study too, and it's very low. Lamprey much prefer fish with cycloid scales, the tiny little scales like trout and salmon. They will attack bass, walleye, carp, you name it, but generally speaking, their preferred host are trout and salmon. So when you get lamprey populations that are very high, one of the things you'll see is attacks on fish with ctenoid scales.
But the thousands of fish you saw, it was pretty small
very,
percentage.
Very few.
I'm trying to remember, but it's less than like 2%
yeah.
of a wound rate. It's not anything close to the salmon wounding rate. Bass are in shallow water too, which is.
While we're on the topic of oxygen and temperature management, that's something else. I think there's some take-home points too. The professional level tournaments, they've been doing this a long time. They've got good equipment. They've got a lot of expertise. They know they can monitor temperature and even dissolved oxygen levels relatively easy. One of the things I'm going to focus a little bit more on this summer is working with some of the amateur events, folks that don't have necessarily the expertise or the equipment to watch that stuff really closely. And something as simple as providing shade over the weigh-in tanks, for example. They fill those tanks in the morning, it's kind of cool. They sit there all day, sun's getting higher and higher, water temperature starts creeping up. Well, then, oh, gee, maybe we ought to throw some ice in there when the temperature goes down. Or they don't, and the temperatures continue to go up. So I think there's some room for improvement with some of the amateur and club level tournaments too. And that's something that there's probably something worth doing. In tournaments come in all shapes and sizes. I mean, the big professional level events might attract a couple hundred anglers and a couple hundred co-anglers. Thank you. In some of the club level events might be 10 guys from Joe's Bass Club,
right?
From Connecticut or Albany County or whatever. So they have just as much right to use this resource as anybody else, and they spend a few dollars in the basin. So it's worth initiating a dialogue with some of those folks.
But as you mentioned, they don't have the equipment or necessarily the expertise.
Yeah. And there's not only our recommendations, but there are some other guidelines that have been developed by the industry itself over the last 10, 20 years. And sometimes I think we just need to get those publications and blow the dust off them and make sure that they're out there too.
Yeah.
The ongoing battle over invasive species, I remember you sounding the alarm 5-6 years ago about the spiny water flea that has now spread into Lake George, and of course that's just south of Lake Champlain, with a river connecting the two, the Lachute River. Is it just a matter of time before that invasive species, the spiny water flea, makes it into Lake Champlain, and is that something you and other researchers are keeping a close eye on?
Yeah, we did sound the alarm about spiny water flea as a scientific community a couple of years ago, and especially now since it's moved into Lake George, which directly flows into Lake Champlain. It's a very 2-mile trip down a river. That and boat traffic and other possible avenues of transfer, most professionals feel like it's inevitable that spiny water flea will not only get into Lake Champlain, but into other water bodies as well, from both Lake George and Sacandaga Lake, where it currently is. And it's thought to have come there from Lake Ontario, where it's been established for decades. So yes, we're concerned. It will have a serious impact on the food web in any lake that spiny water flea invades. We actually conduct the monitoring for New York for this side of the lake at the Lake Champlain Research Institute, and we've been through all the samples that were taken up through last year, through 2013, and we have detected no spiny water fleas in any of those samples. So that's the good news. We have not detected spiny water flea in Lake Champlain yet. We're starting that work this year. The field work just started a matter of a few weeks ago. So we're looking again, looking to see if they're gonna be established in the lake. We hope not, but given the avenues of transport and the invasiveness of this species, the chances are in the next 5 years we will unfortunately probably be back here talking about spiny water flea having invaded in Lake Champlain.
And what is the biggest fear as far as the effect or the impact on the lake?
Well, they have this giant spine which prevents predation by the fish community, and then they're voracious predators on the rest of the smaller planktonic community. So,
which the other fish eat.
Yeah, right. So there'll be potentially a pretty big shift in energy flow through the food web. And we don't know what the implications of that will be, but it's probably not a good thing to shift your food web around dramatically and then expect it to be the same at the top end at the fishery, where we're fishing for salmon, bass, and other things.
And are there other invasives on the radar right now for Lake Champlain?
Well, one that's got my attention continues to be quagga mussel. So people are very familiar with zebra mussels. Quagga mussels have largely replaced zebra mussels is the problem in the Great Lakes. They can build incredible densities. They can also live much deeper in the lake than zebra mussels. So they have that much more filtering capability, that much more impact on the zooplankton community. And we've seen some real impacts. They're in the St. Lawrence River, they're in the Erie Barge Canal system.
So they're getting closer.
Yeah, coming at us from two directions. And round gobies continue to be a concern. There are large populations of the round goby native to Eastern Europe. They're well established in the St. Lawrence. They're also moving east through the canal system.
So if they're in the St. Lawrence, what would the Great Chazy would connect them potentially to Lake Champlain? Or
well, they'd have to come up through the Richelieu.
Yeah,
through the Richelieu.
Or be transporting illegally
by somebody.
And
when you talk about the quagga mussels, now do they attach themselves to boats? So if you have boats coming up
very similar to
Erie
zebra
Canal
mussel.
and Champlain
In
Canal.
fact, they're hard to tell the difference between zebra mussel and quagga mussel without a little information or training. So yeah, abyssal threads, the adults can fasten themselves to hard structures, either man-made or natural. So rocks, boats, docks, anchors, that sort of thing.
And spiny water flea is also a concern with Champlain Canal. The Champlain Canal is a concern really almost all the time with respect to potentially invasives moving through. And
now in Lake George, they've taken some pretty significant steps over the past few years as far as the lake steward program, boat inspections, now washing stations to wash boats down, and a number of people looking at that and thinking those may be good ideas for lakes throughout New York State.
they would.
Yep. Or the country.
Is Lake Champlain so large, though, that it would be hard to have an effective inspection program or boat washing with so many boat launches and docks and spots where boats are going in?
More difficult. It's by state. Lake George is a much smaller watershed with much fewer boat ramps, you're right. But not that we shouldn't try to do something, because really that's how you're going to help prevent invasives is at boat launches.
Yeah, I can mention something that we're working on in concert with the Great Lakes Sea Grant Network folks. We've been working with bass tournaments and walleye tournaments to see what sorts of educational efforts could take place, and we've had a lot of support from the industry, and we've now got training materials that are available for tournament organizers on how to do a wash down of all of the member boats in that tournament, for example, so we can go out with fact sheets and PowerPoints and even demonstrate with power washers on how to do that. It's not difficult. It's just something that people need to do. So as an educator, I come down on the education side as opposed to the regulatory side of this thing. If we can get everybody to adopt these inspect, clean, drain, dry principles, you know, if you're moving water or wet stuff or plant material, you're potentially moving invasives. And we're a mobile society. Tournament anglers are very mobile. If we can just kind of step back and think about not moving wet stuff or water or plant material, visible plant material or other invasives, we can stop this chain. We can go a long ways to preventing the spread of invasive species.
One point to make about invasives in Lake Champlain is we have dozens fewer invasive species than the rest of the Great Lakes because we're kind of isolated. There's a real chance here in Lake Champlain to actually prevent some of the things that are very nasty players in the Great Lakes if we act now, if we deal with it now. So the more proactive we can be, the better, because Lake Champlain doesn't have a lot of the invasives that potentially we could get. So really the time is now to do it.
And while there's obviously concern about invasive species, it seems much of the focus on Lake Champlain is still, and many still see the biggest threat as phosphorus runoff pollution. State of Vermont and everyone else still trying to come up with the best plans to tackle the phosphorus and the runoff. Overall, though, how is the health of Lake Champlain?
I always tell people that it's in pretty good condition, and I'm comparing it to other Great Lakes and other systems. We have fewer invasive species. We are controlling phosphorus, actually doing a reasonably good job. I know there's been a lot of press about, you know, the loads in the rivers and trying to reduce them from the watersheds, and we're making progress on that. So, well, I think we could continue to do better to control phosphorus pollution. We should work very hard at preventing future invasive species from arriving. Generally speaking, I think this lake is in better shape than, I would say, than most of the rest of the Great Lakes, for sure.
Yeah, I'd concur with that. It's a lot of the problem areas get a lot of attention, and you know, for example, Missisquoi Bay, it's well deserved, but it's not the large part of the lake. You know, it needs some attention. And we should. And
it gets the attention because with the phosphorus load, you can get the blue-green algae, and you can get the ugly blue-green algae in the summertime, and obviously that gets people's attention.
There's some evidence and research that's been done on Lake Champlain, actually, with respect to blue-green algae, that's just come out and been published, that suggests that some of what's going on with blue-green algae in Lake Champlain is not necessarily all driven by nutrients, that it's probably climate change having an impact as well. The microcystis, the particular algae that blooms so much, is much more of a warmer water adapted taxon. So it's becoming more prevalent in Lake Champlain as the lake warms up. So it's not necessarily just a nutrient issue. And
phosphorus has always been pointed to as the culprit. So
there's always more than one facet that affects any organism, and we often focus on one, and maybe to the detriment of the others.
And even small changes in temperature can
even this 1 degree increase in the lake can make it much more of a microcystis lake than what it used to be 50 years ago.
And I'll kind of move into more of a philosophical discussion of stress in general on a lake system. You know, if we increase the water temperature, if we bring in invasive species, if we don't control nutrient input, there's going to be winners and losers in the biological community. And some of the winners, ironically, are things like largemouth bass. They will be happy in a warmer lake, in a lake with more plant material.
A more productive, warmer lake is a bass lake.
So that's good for the bass population. What are the to the detriment?
And invasive species too. Sometimes it's hard to convey to bass anglers that we don't want to move invasive species. We've brought alewife into the system now. Probably hasn't hurt the bass fishery at all. If anything, it's probably served as a good food source for bass, and that's largely been documented in St. Lawrence, for example. So some of the invasive species, some of the changes that we as humans are inflicting on the lake, there's going to be winners like bass. Now, trout and salmon, you know, we get a warmer lake, we get changes in the lower food web situation from Bythotrephes, spiny water flea. They could be on the losing side of this sort of thing. If we change the system so that there's not as much food energy out, or it's not as good a habitat out in the deep cold water, we can expect the fish that like the deep cold water to suffer. So.
And I remember when the alewives were first an issue several years ago, one of the concerns was that the impact they could have on trout, in particular, but in enzyme or that was a concern. Have some of the worst fears about the alewives come to fruition, or has it been not really in that long of a period of time?
The thiaminase issue is still being studied. They have seen the impacts of thiaminase problems in salmon in the hatcheries, primarily the Edweed hatchery over here in Vermont, and they can control that and deal with that in the hatchery system. The sad part of the concern is you can't deal with it in the wild. So if you've got small fish that are hatching out whose parents fed on alewife that had thiaminase in them, they're going to be thiamine deficient. It's going to be difficult to help those out. But you know, it is what it is.
And I know you're not ornithologist, but the cormorants problem on the lake, holding steady, getting worse, getting better?
I think there's a lot of management control going on, and I think both sides of the lake, both states, I believe, are pretty aggressive in controlling cormorants these days. And just anecdotally, there don't seem to be as many in the areas that we go. And where we moor our boat, primarily near Valcour Island. We do see them, but not maybe as prevalent as 5 years ago.
Yeah, you could check with some of the management agencies, but there's been significant efforts to reduce that population. You know, they're not going to eradicate it, but there are control efforts in place, and they're probably having some impact. There again, the bottom line has changed. People talk about impacts to the fish community from cormorants. Hard to document. One good diet study that was done quite a few years ago now indicated that the major diet component for cormorants were yellow perch. In more recent work, and I can guarantee you that that's changed now, because as things like alewife become more available, these birds will switch to, you know, they're opportunistic. They're going to switch to whatever's there in the most numbers that's easiest to catch. So sometimes you're going to see some changes. Well, you're always going to see some changes associated with these systems.
Cormorants are interesting because they're native and they're not necessarily invasive.
No, and they're protected.
Yeah.
Cormorant was the poster child for DDT. So we were trying to save cormorants 50 years ago. Now they're a nuisance in Lake Champlain. When 50 years ago, maybe they were just as common now as they may be getting to the densities they used to be at in Lake Champlain. It's an interesting management dilemma, right? They haven't been here for so long, we've forgotten they were here.
They were saved before, that's interesting.
And we tried to save them. They were the poster child for DDT.
So for your research this summer, what's the top priority?
We're still doing the monitoring work, assessing, you know, whether the invaders are coming like spiny water flea. Actually, I have some interesting projects going on with a few grad students dealing primarily with zooplankton in Adirondack lakes and in Lake Champlain. So we did a comparison of Lake George and Lake Champlain last year in terms of the planktonic communities.
And
so
again,
we have some
that's
interesting
so important
things.
because that's the food source for so many other types of fish.
Yeah, so it's kind of where I work in the food web in the middle part. Yeah, the zooplankton are these tiny little crustaceans, kind of the middle of the food web. They eat the algae, the fish eat them, and then it goes up through the food chain to the salmon and the bass and the fish we all want to fish for.
So are you looking now not only at factors, pollution and other factors, but also climate change for the impact on zooplankton?
We have a long-term data set, so climate change is a big part of what we're trying to address and see if the patterns exist. There is some evidence from data that we've got that climate change has affected the lake's algae populations, that we've shifted some of the blue-green community, and it may actually be mostly because of the temperature increase. And so, you know, as long as there's enough nutrients there, temperature may be what's driving it over the edge.
For me, I'm an extension specialist. I'm mostly charged with doing outreach and extension, so I need to take some of this good work that's been done, including the dispersal project on bass and some other Tim's work, and get it out there to the folks that need it. So, and the project I mentioned in terms of training tournament organizers on invasive species spread prevention, going to be doing some work on that. So, outreach.
Mark's doing an interesting one with ice fishermen. Assessing ice fishermen.
Yeah, we just kind of got started this late winter a little bit, kind of gauging people's opinions about average ice cover and has it changed their methods of fishing or species that they target or frequency of occurrence. We were really looking to see, how if people's behaviors may have changed with changes in ice cover over the last 10 or 15 years. It was sort of an ironic year to do a survey like that, because when you start asking people about reduced ice cover this past winter, it's like, no, this is the worst I've ever seen.
Fresh on their minds,
We went back
over several years.
We went back 50 years this last year to what the ice cover used to be in Lake Champlain. It hasn't been like this in quite some time.
And that's a big topic of conversation right now. Is the changing climate having a long-term impact on the number of years and the percentage of the lake that's covered by ice?
In your average 10-year period, the lake would normally ice up back in the 1800s. 8 out of those 10 years. I'm talking from Burlington across the lake to Plattsburgh. Now we're lucky if it's 2 years out of 10.
And you leave the factors behind it to other scientists to worry about, but you're documenting what are clearly changes.
Yeah, there's a very strong ice cover data set. It goes back to the 1800s, documented, I believe, at the Burlington waterfront.
Yeah, there's when it comes to climate change too, another thing that people can look at is a change in hydrology or lake level or lake levels. And I just became aware of a study, haven't seen it yet. It's actually a high school student in Burlington, as I understand it, has done a very technical analysis with with help and statistics, the whole 9 yards, to look at average lake levels over the last, since the 70s. And that some of that work had been done previously by USGS folks, but I think this is it's going to be an interesting report to look at.
Interest and sped up after 2011 when we saw the lake so high and the flooding.
And it's not only a warmer world, it's a wetter world around here.
And I think most people are preparing, or at least being told to prepare for times when you're going to see the lake at those levels.
Yeah,
and
we're likely to have the global climate sort of models that are out there predict that we may have more precipitation, but also more intense storm events. And
so where you get an Irene, where you could get an 11 or 12 inch storm.
And then the question is, well, do you get more of this precipitation in the form of rain versus snow, or when does that occur? You know, so even if you don't change the lake levels, you may see more sudden changes in those lake levels. Even if you don't change the overall height of the lake, you might see more sudden changes. Who knows? So I mean, those are things are worth paying attention to.
The bottom line is, if you live near a river or the lake shore, you need to be prepared for the flooding that you might encounter.
And it may not be what you remember from 20, 30 years ago.
And my daddy always told me, don't build in the floodplain.
More people are taking his advice, but
I think
many
more
others
people should take that
many
advice.
others are still there, so it will be an issue. Well, interesting studies, and gentlemen, thanks a lot for taking the time. Mark Malchoff and Tim Mihuc, we appreciate you coming by.
Thank you.
No problem.